She gave away the last bread she owned to a dying stranger, and by sunrise, 50 mounted riders were kneeling in the frozen dirt outside her cabin. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from tonight. And if you still believe kindness matters out here in this hard old world, stay with me. Because Evelyn Harper was about to learn something the frontier rarely taught gently. Winter had settled deep across the Wyoming plains that year. The kind of cold that crept beneath doors, wrapped itself around old bones, and stayed there till morning. Evelyn's cabin stood alone at the edge of a dead-grass valley nearly 12 miles from the nearest town. Most folks had forgotten the place existed. The roof sagged beneath old snow. One shutter hung crooked in the wind. Smoke barely rose from the chimney because there was barely enough wood left to burn. Inside, the widow sat beside a weak oil lamp, counting crumbs on a plate. One heel of bread, half a jar of beans, 2 cups of flour if she stretched it careful. That was all the food she owned until Sunday. The wind outside carried the dry smell of dust and frozen sagebrush. Somewhere beyond the hills, a coyote cried once. Then everything fell quiet again. Evelyn pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stared at the empty chair across from the fire. Her husband Thomas had carved that chair himself 15 winters earlier. Nobody had sat in it since the fever took him. Out here, loneliness settled into a house the same way snow settled onto fences. Slow, silent, permanent. Then came the sound. Hoofbeats. Faint at first. Uneven. Wrong somehow. Evelyn lifted her head slowly. Nobody rode this far west after dark unless they were lost or desperate. The horse appeared through the blowing dust like a shadow dragged out of the night. Black coat, streaked with sweat. Foam around the mouth. The rider swayed once in the saddle before sliding sideways and crashing hard into the frozen earth beside her fence. Evelyn stood motionless near the doorway. Her fingers tightened around the lantern handle. The man didn't move. For several seconds, only the wind spoke. Then the horse let out a tired breath and lowered its head beside him. Evelyn stepped closer carefully, boots crunching over frost-covered dirt. The stranger looked somewhere near 40. Dark coat, dust-covered gloves. A deep tear across one sleeve stained dark from dried blood. But what caught Evelyn's eye wasn't the wound. It was the way the man held onto a worn leather satchel, even unconscious, like whatever sat inside mattered more than his own life. His lips moved slightly, barely a whisper. Don't let them find it. Evelyn glanced toward the dark horizon. Nothing but open plains and moonlight. Still, something unsettled her. The old widow had survived too many winters not to trust the feeling that trouble traveled ahead of certain men. She should have closed the door, should have gone back inside, should have protected the little she had left. Instead, she knelt slowly beside the stranger, touched his freezing hand, and felt how close to death the cold had already pulled him. A long silence passed across the valley. Then Evelyn Harper made the decision that would change her life before sunrise. She slipped her arm beneath the wounded traveler's shoulders and whispered softly into the frozen Wyoming night. Well, I suppose half a loaf is still enough for 2 people. The stranger weighed more than Evelyn expected. Not heavy with strength anymore, but with exhaustion. The kind men carried after too many nights sleeping in saddles and too many years trusting the wrong roads. She dragged him inch by inch across the porch while the lantern swung in the wind beside her, throwing long yellow shadows over the snow-dusted boards. The horse followed close behind, slow and obedient, like it knew the old widow was the only thing standing between its rider and the grave. Inside the cabin, warmth barely existed. The fire had burned down to glowing coals hours ago, and the air smelled faintly of cold ash, pine smoke, and old coffee grounds. Evelyn eased the man onto the narrow bed near the stove and stepped back to catch her breath. Her hands trembled from effort and age. For a moment, she simply stood there listening to him breathe. Slow, uneven, alive, but only barely. She cut away the torn fabric around his shoulder, carefully with her sewing scissors. The wound looked older than she expected. Not fresh. Days old maybe. The skin around it burned hot with fever. Whoever this man was, he had ridden hard, while carrying pain most folks would not survive through one night. Evelyn heated water in a dented kettle and cleaned the wound in silence. The stranger stirred once, jaw tightening slightly, but never opened his eyes. Up close, she noticed the weather lines around his face. Not a cruel face, just a tired one. A man who had spent too many years outdoors carrying responsibilities nobody thanked him for. Outside, the wind rattled the loose shutter again. Evelyn froze. There it was, far off across the valley. Another sound. Hoofbeats. Not close enough to see yet, but there, moving somewhere beyond the dark hills. Her eyes drifted toward the window. The stranger's whisper returned to her mind. Do not let them find it. Slowly, Evelyn looked toward the leather satchel still clutched against his chest. Even unconscious, his fingers refused to release it. She considered taking it away. Looking inside. Maybe there was money. Maybe trouble. Out here, those two things usually traveled together. Instead, she pulled her hand back. A person either kept their word in this world, or they became like the cold. Hard. Empty. She moved to the kitchen shelf and stared at the last loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. Thomas had baked that loaf 3 days before the fever took him years ago. Afterward, Evelyn taught herself to make bread the same way he did. Same cracked iron pan. Same pinch of salt. Same prayer whispered under her breath while the dough rose beside the stove. Tonight, that loaf was supposed to last her until Sunday. She broke it slowly down the middle anyway. The crust cracked softly in the quiet cabin. One half smaller than the other. She gave herself the smaller piece without thinking about it. When the stranger finally woke near midnight, the firelight reflected softly in pale gray eyes sharpened by instinct before memory caught up to him. His hand flew toward the satchel immediately. Then he saw the old widow sitting nearby in a wooden chair, eating dry bread beside the stove like it was a feast. Neither spoke for several seconds. Wind sighed through the walls. The horse shifted outside beneath the lean-to. Finally, Evelyn pushed the larger half of bread toward him across the table. You look like you need it more than me. The stranger stared at the bread, then at her. Something unreadable crossed his face. Not pride, not suspicion, something sadder than both. Ma'am, he said quietly, his voice rough as gravel roads. You should not have done this. Evelyn took another small bite and looked toward the dark window where the distant hoofbeats still echoed faintly somewhere beyond the valley. Too late now, she whispered. The stranger ate slowly. Not like a starving man. Like someone who had learned long ago that food could disappear faster than trust. Evelyn watched him from across the stove while weak firelight flickered against the cabin walls. Outside, the Wyoming wind dragged dry snow across the porch in soft, scratching waves. Every few minutes the horse beneath the lean-to stamped nervously against the frozen ground. The man noticed it too. His eyes lifted toward the door each time, alert even through exhaustion. Your horse seems smarter than most people, Evelyn said quietly. The corner of his mouth almost moved into a smile. Almost. His name is Ranger, he answered. He does not like staying in one place too long. Evelyn nodded slowly, as if that explained more than it should. Out here, folks learned to hear truths hidden inside ordinary sentences. Men who kept moving usually had reasons. Some were running from the law, others from grief. Sometimes both. The stranger finished the last crumb of bread and sat in silence for a long while, turning the empty tin cup between his rough hands. Finally he looked up. You live out here alone? Evelyn poked the fire carefully with an iron rod before answering. Long enough that people stopped asking. Another silence settled over the room. Not awkward, just heavy, like old wood carrying too many winters. The stranger's eyes drifted across the cabin. The worn Bible near the lamp. Thomas Harper's old coat hanging beside the door. The sewing basket near the stove with thread carefully wrapped too. Save every inch. He noticed everything. Men who survived dangerous roads usually did. Your husband? He asked gently, nodding toward the coat. Evelyn stared into the fire for several seconds before answering. Fever took him 12 years ago. The stranger lowered his eyes slightly after that. Respectful. I am sorry, ma'am. She shrugged once. The plains do not stop for sorrow. Outside, the wind shifted suddenly. Then came another sound. Faint but clear now. Hoofbeats. Closer than before. The stranger went still instantly. Not frightened. Calculating. His hand moved toward the satchel beside the bed. Evelyn noticed how his breathing changed. Slower. Controlled. Like a man listening for danger through walls. Friends of yours? She asked quietly. He did not answer right away. Instead, he stood carefully despite the pain in his shoulder and moved toward the window. Moonlight silvered the side of his face as he peered through the frost-covered glass. The valley beyond remained empty except for drifting snow and dark hills rolling west beneath the stars. Still, the hoofbeats lingered somewhere out there, near enough now to feel wrong. "I need to leave before morning," he said finally. Evelyn let out a dry laugh. "You can barely stand. That does not change the fact." He rested one hand against the wall briefly as dizziness crossed his face. The old widow studied him quietly. Men revealed themselves most honestly when they were wounded. Some became cruel, some afraid. This one only seemed tired, deeply tired. "You got family waiting somewhere?" she asked. The stranger stared out the window for so long she thought he might ignore the question entirely. Then he spoke softly. "Used to." The fire cracked gently between them. Evelyn looked down at her empty plate and realized neither of them had enough left in life to waste energy pretending. "Well," she said at last, rising slowly from her chair, "you are not riding anywhere tonight." She crossed the room and placed another log onto the weak fire. The flames lifted higher for a moment, washing warm gold across the cabin walls. Then the sound came again. Hoofbeats. This time close enough that Ranger suddenly jerked beneath the lean-to outside and let out a low, nervous whine. The stranger's face changed instantly. Not fear, recognition. And in the next breath, someone out beyond the dark valley blew a long, low whistle through the freezing Wyoming night. The whistle echoed once across the valley and disappeared into the Wyoming dark like something carried away by the wind itself. Ranger answered immediately beneath the lean-to, stomping hard enough to rattle the old water barrel beside the cabin wall. The stranger closed his eyes briefly when he heard it. Not panic, resignation. The kind a man wore after spending too many years outrunning things that always caught up eventually. Evelyn stood motionless near the stove, listening. Nothing followed the whistle at first. No voices. No riders appearing over the hills. Just silence settling heavy over the plains again. But it was no longer peaceful silence. This one felt watchful. "You know who that was?" Evelyn said quietly. The stranger kept his eyes on the window. Frost had begun creeping across the corners of the glass in pale, silver veins. "Maybe," he answered. "Maybe is not much comfort at midnight." He almost smiled again at that, though exhaustion swallowed it before it fully arrived. "Comfort has not traveled with me for a long time." Evelyn crossed slowly to the shelf above the sink and reached for the old shotgun Thomas used to keep near the back door. The wood stock had faded smooth after years of handling. She checked the shells carefully with steady hands. The stranger noticed. "You know how to use that?" Evelyn looked at him over the barrel. "Out here, everybody learns." Another sound drifted through the valley then. Closer now. Leather creaking. Horses moving slow through snow. More than one. The stranger stepped away from the window immediately. "Blow out the lamp." Evelyn did not argue. The cabin fell dim except for the weak orange glow from the stove. Shadows stretched long across the walls while both of them listened to the darkness outside. Hoofbeats circled somewhere beyond the fence line. Slow, patient, not the reckless noise of outlaws or drunks. Whoever rode out there knew exactly what they were doing. Ranger shifted nervously again. Then came another whistle. Shorter this time. Answered faintly from farther west. Evelyn felt cold settle deeper into her chest. "How many?" she whispered. The stranger listened carefully before answering. "At least 6. Maybe more." "Lawman." He hesitated. "No." That one word carried enough weight to silence the room again. Evelyn tightened her grip on the shotgun. The stranger noticed immediately. "If they come to the door," he said quietly, "you tell them you never saw me. You think I dragged a half-frozen man into my house just to hand him over?" His jaw tightened slightly. "Ma'am, you do not understand what follows me." "Maybe not," Evelyn answered, "but I understand winter. And I understand hungry men." Outside, one of the riders moved close enough that snow crunched softly beneath horse hooves near the barn. Then stillness again. Nobody knocked. Nobody called out. That unsettled Evelyn more than anything else. Men with bad intentions usually arrived loud. Quiet men were harder to predict. The stranger moved slowly toward the bed and retrieved the leather satchel, holding it close against his ribs despite the pain it clearly caused him. Evelyn watched carefully. "What is inside that thing?" she asked. For the first time since arriving, the stranger looked directly into her eyes without turning away. Firelight caught the tired gray in his face. "Something people have spent years searching for." "Money." "No, then what?" The stranger glanced toward the dark window again where shapes seemed to move beyond the frost. Proof. Before Evelyn could ask another question, a horse stopped directly outside the cabin porch, close enough now to hear the animal breathing. The boards creaked beneath slow boots. Then came a knock against the front door. 3 soft taps. Polite. Controlled. Somehow far more frightening than shouting would have been. The stranger's entire body went still beside the dying fire. Then a calm voice drifted through the wood from outside. "Captain Reed." The man said softly, "We know you are in there." The cabin seemed to shrink after the voice spoke through the door. Firelight flickered weakly across the walls, while snow hissed softly outside beneath restless horses. Evelyn could hear leather saddles creaking now. Several men, maybe more, waiting beyond the darkness. The stranger beside the stove lowered his head briefly, like a man hearing a ghost speak his name after years buried beneath silence. Captain Reed. So that was who he was. Evelyn glanced toward him carefully. "You did not mention the captain part." Silas Reed let out a tired breath through his nose. "I was hoping it belonged to another lifetime." The knock came again. 3 calm taps against old wood. Not impatient. Certain. A second voice called from outside, deeper this time. "Captain, we are not here to harm the widow." Evelyn tightened her grip on the shotgun anyway. Men often promised peace right before trouble arrived. Silas stepped slowly toward the door before pain caught him halfway there. He steadied himself against the table, face pale beneath the firelight. The ride and fever had drained nearly everything from him. "Do not open it yet," he said quietly. "Why?" Evelyn asked. Silas looked toward the frost-covered window where shadows shifted beyond the porch. "Because if they found me this quickly, others may not be far behind." The old widow studied him carefully. Even wounded, the man carried himself differently than ordinary drifters. Not arrogant. Disciplined. Every movement measured. Like someone who once gave orders men trusted with their lives. Outside, one horse snorted sharply in the cold. Then silence again. Finally, Evelyn lowered the shotgun slightly and spoke toward the door without opening it. "If you mean no harm, you can state your business from outside." Snow crunched softly beneath boots on the porch. "Ma'am," the deep voice answered respectfully, "my name is Jeremiah Boone. I rode with Captain Reed during the war." Silas closed his eyes briefly after hearing the name. Something old and heavy passed across his face. "Jeremiah should not be here," he murmured. "Nobody should." Evelyn moved closer to the door, but kept the chain locked. Through the narrow crack, she saw a tall man standing beneath the porch lantern. Gray beard dusted with frost. Long coat stiff with snow. Behind him waited 6 riders in silence beside the fence line, their horses steaming in the freezing air. None held weapons. None moved carelessly. They simply watched the cabin with the stillness of tired men who had ridden all night. Jeremiah removed his hat slowly. "Ma'am, we tracked Ranger through the valley. We feared the captain might not survive the storm." Evelyn glanced back toward Silas. "You have friends worried about you." Silas gave a quiet, humorless laugh. "Those men are too stubborn to quit anything." Jeremiah heard him through the cracked doorway and smiled faintly for the first time. "That goes both ways, Captain." For several seconds nobody spoke. Wind swept snow across the porch steps while the lantern flame danced weakly overhead. Then Jeremiah's expression darkened slightly. "You need to leave before dawn," he said carefully. "Word is spreading faster than we thought." Silas straightened despite the pain in his shoulder. "How close?" Jeremiah hesitated just long enough to answer the question without words. "Close. Very close." Evelyn felt the air inside the cabin shift. Whatever followed Silas Reed was larger than one wounded traveler lost in winter. Much larger. She saw it now in the riders waiting silently outside, in the respect woven through every word they spoke to him, in the way hardened men crossed frozen plains through the night just to reach this forgotten cabin. Silas moved toward the door slowly and rested one hand against the frame. "Did they follow you?" Jeremiah lowered his eyes briefly before answering. "Not tonight." The answer should have sounded comforting. Somehow it did not. Then from somewhere far across the dark Wyoming valley came another sound drifting through the wind. More hoofbeats. Many more this time. The new hoofbeats rolled across the valley like distant thunder over frozen earth. Not 6 riders this time. Not even 10. Evelyn felt the vibration faintly beneath the cabin floorboards before the sound fully reached the house. Outside, Jeremiah Boone turned sharply in the saddle, eyes narrowing toward the western hills. The other riders moved instantly, hands tightening on reins, shoulders straightening beneath snow-covered coats. Nobody panicked. That frightened Evelyn more than panic would have. Experienced men only grew that quiet when they understood exactly what danger sounded like. Silas stepped beside the window slowly, one hand pressed against his injured shoulder. Firelight painted hard shadows beneath his tired eyes while he listened to the approaching riders. "How many?" he asked without turning. Jeremiah answered from outside. "Too dark to tell." But his voice carried enough concern to say the number was not small. The wind shifted across the valley then, carrying the sharp scent of horses, cold leather, and chimney smoke from town 12 miles east. Evelyn frowned slightly. "Townfolk do not ride out this far after midnight." Jeremiah gave a grim nod. "Not unless somebody sent them." Silence settled over the porch again. Snow drifted sideways through the lantern glow while the distant riders continued closing slowly through the darkness. Silas stared toward the hills for several long seconds before speaking quietly. "They found the telegraph office." Jeremiah lowered his head once. "By sundown yesterday." Evelyn looked between the two men. "Somebody care to explain what exactly is happening around my cabin?" Silas remained silent at first. Then he carefully set the leather satchel onto the table beside the stove. For the first time since arriving, he loosened the strap around it. Not fully, just enough for Evelyn to glimpse papers inside wrapped tightly in oilcloth. Official papers. Thick stacks of them. Jeremiah removed his gloves slowly outside the door and spoke through the crack in a lower voice now. 3 years ago, Captain Reed disappeared after escorting federal payroll records across Montana territory. Evelyn blinked. Payroll records? Corruption records, Silas corrected quietly. His voice sounded tired beyond exhaustion now. Names. Land seizures, railroad deals, payments stolen from settlers and soldiers. He stared at the satchel like a man carrying stones instead of paper. Men became very wealthy, making sure these papers never reached Washington. Another wave of hoofbeats echoed closer across the valley. More distinct now. Evelyn could hear loose tack, rattling in the cold air. She stepped toward the window carefully and froze. Tiny lantern lights flickered far out near the hills. Several of them. Moving together. "Dear Lord," she whispered softly. Jeremiah looked over his shoulder toward the approaching lights. "Captain, if they corner us here." "No," Silas interrupted calmly. "Not here." He turned toward Evelyn then, and for the first time she saw genuine guilt in his face. "Ma'am, I never meant to bring this to your door." Evelyn stared back at him quietly. Strange thing about loneliness. After enough years, fear stopped ruling people the same way. There was no husband left to protect, no children sleeping upstairs, no reputation left in town worth saving. Just an old widow and a frozen cabin most folks already forgot existed. She picked up the kettle from the stove and poured hot water calmly into 3 cups, as if dozens of riders were not descending toward her property in the middle of the night. "Well," she said softly, handing 1 cup toward Silas. "Seems trouble found the place on its own." Jeremiah let out the faintest laugh from outside the door. The first warm sound anyone had made all night. Then it happened. A lantern emerged over the nearest hill. Then another beside it. Then another. Rider after rider appearing slowly through blowing snow until the dark Wyoming valley looked filled with floating lights drifting toward Evelyn Harper's lonely cabin. The lantern lights kept multiplying across the valley until Evelyn lost count somewhere past 30. They moved slowly through the snow like a river of fire winding down from the hills toward her cabin. No shouting, no gunfire, just the steady rhythm of horses crossing frozen earth beneath a moon hidden behind storm clouds. Inside the cabin, even the fire seemed quieter now. Silas Reed stood near the table gripping the edge hard enough for his knuckles to pale beneath the flickering light. Fever still clung to him, but something else had returned to his face now. Duty. The kind men carried whether they wanted it or not. Jeremiah Boone pushed the cabin door open halfway and stepped inside, bringing a burst of cold wind and snowflakes with him. His boots left melting tracks across the old floorboards. "Captain," he said carefully, "those are not bounty men." Silas looked up sharply. "You sure?" Jeremiah nodded once. Too organized. Too calm. He removed his hat slowly, brushing snow from the brim. and they are carrying cavalry lantern signals. Evelyn frowned from beside the stove. Cavalry. Jeremiah glanced toward her. United States cavalry used them during the war. Most folks would not recognize the patterns. Silas moved toward the frosted window again, his face tightening as distant lights reflected faintly in his tired gray eyes. Whoever they are, he murmured, they know exactly where to find me. Outside, Ranger shifted nervously beneath the lean-to while the approaching riders continued descending into the valley in near-perfect silence. Evelyn suddenly realized something strange. She could hear dozens of horses now, but no drunken yelling, no reckless laughter, no threats carried on the wind. These men rode like soldiers returning to church. Disciplined, respectful, careful. The old widow wrapped her shawl tighter around herself and looked toward Silas. Exactly who were you before all this? For a long moment, only the wind answered. Then Silas finally spoke without turning around. During the war, I commanded the 7th Frontier Cavalry. Jeremiah lowered his eyes slightly after hearing the title spoken aloud again. Even now, years later, it carried weight. Evelyn stared quietly. You were military. Silas gave a faint, tired nod. A long time ago. And those papers? Silas looked toward the satchel resting beside the stove. Evidence against men who used the war to steal land from settlers, widows, and soldiers who never came home. Evelyn felt something twist quietly in her chest after that. She thought about the banker in town who took half her property after Thomas died because of a loan her husband never fully understood. Thought about the railroad men who promised fair prices before cutting farms apart track by track. Out here, poor folks learned quickly that powerful men often smiled while taking everything. Jeremiah moved beside the window and peered into the storm. Captain, he whispered. Silas stepped closer. Then both men froze. The riders had stopped. Every lantern in the valley stood motionless now, less than 200 yards from the cabin. Row after row of mounted figures waiting silently in the snow beneath the dark Wyoming sky. Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. Why are they stopping? Nobody answered immediately. Then, slowly, one rider separated from the others and began approaching the cabin alone. Tall horse, long dark coat, lantern hanging low beside the saddle. As the rider drew closer, the firelight from the porch revealed silver hair beneath a cavalry hat weathered by years of hard winters. Silas inhaled sharply beside the window. Not fear this time. Shock. Real shock. Jeremiah whispered under his breath, almost like a prayer. Good Lord. The old rider stopped directly before the porch steps and looked toward the cabin door. Even from inside, Evelyn could feel the weight of his presence. Then the rider removed his gloves carefully and spoke one calm sentence through the frozen night. Captain Reed, he said softly, the men have come to finish the ride with you. For a long moment, nobody inside the cabin moved. The only sound came from the wind brushing snow against the porch steps and the soft crackle of dying firewood behind Evelyn Harper. Outside, dozens of mounted riders waited in complete silence across the frozen valley while lantern light flickered against drifting snow. The old rider on the horse never raised his voice again. He did not need to. Something about the way those men waited carried more weight than shouting ever could. Silas Reed stood frozen near the window, staring through the frost-covered glass like a man watching the past ride out of the dark to collect him. Jeremiah Boone removed his hat slowly beside the door. General Whitaker, he whispered quietly. Evelyn looked sharply toward him. General? Jeremiah nodded once without taking his eyes off the rider outside. Nathaniel Whitaker commanded the Western Cavalry after the war. Evelyn studied Silas again. The old widow had spent years believing important men lived in distant cities wearing clean coats behind polished desks. Yet here stood a wounded traveler with snow on his boots and fever in his blood, while an entire column of riders waited outside her cabin for his next breath. Silas finally exhaled slowly and stepped toward the door. His injured shoulder trembled slightly beneath the coat, but his posture changed with every step. Straighter now, older somehow. Like the years between past and present had quietly fallen away. Evelyn touched his arm gently before he reached the door. You should not be standing in this cold. Silas looked down at her hand for a brief second. His expression softened in a way she had not seen before. Ma'am, he said quietly, those men rode through the night because they believed I was already dead. He glanced toward the waiting riders beyond the valley. I cannot let them stand out there wondering. Evelyn released his arm slowly. Then she surprised herself by reaching up and straightening the collar of his worn coat the same way she once used to do for Thomas before winter mornings. Silas looked genuinely startled by the gesture. Maybe because nobody had done something so small for him in a very long time. Go on then, she murmured softly. No sense keeping old soldiers waiting. Jeremiah opened the door carefully. Freezing air rushed inside, carrying the sharp smell of snow, horses, leather, and pine smoke drifting from distant camps beyond the hills. The moment Silas stepped onto the porch, something remarkable happened across the valley. Every rider sat taller in the saddle at once. No command given, no signal spoken, just recognition moving silently through the frozen dark like wind across tall grass. General Whitaker slowly removed his cavalry hat as snow settled into his silver hair. Captain Reed, he called calmly. You look terrible. A faint tired smile finally appeared on Silas's face. You always did know how to greet a man properly, sir. Soft laughter rippled quietly among some of the riders waiting behind him. Not loud, not careless. The sound of weary men relieved to see someone they feared lost forever. Evelyn stepped into the doorway behind Silas, holding her shawl tightly around her shoulders. From there she could finally see the scale of what stood beyond her property. Row after row of mounted riders stretching across the valley floor. Former cavalrymen mostly, older now, some gray-haired, some carrying old military blankets across their saddles, others wearing worn frontier coats patched by hard winters and harder years. Yet every single one sat facing Silas Reed with the same quiet respect. General Whitaker looked toward Evelyn then. His weathered face softened immediately beneath the lantern glow. Ma'am, he said gently, did you give this fool shelter? Evelyn glanced toward Silas beside her. Somebody had to. The old general smiled faintly after that. Then his eyes drifted toward the cabin window where the leather satchel still rested beside the stove. The warmth vanished from his expression almost instantly. Captain, he said carefully now, we rode here to protect those papers. He paused as distant hoofbeats suddenly echoed again somewhere beyond the eastern ridge. Faster this time. Harder. Not cavalry. General Whitaker turned slowly toward the darkness beyond the hills. Looks like we may not be the only ones who found you tonight. The second wave of riders moved nothing like the cavalrymen gathered across Evelyn Harper's valley. These horses came hard through the snow without formation, lanterns swinging wildly as they descended the eastern ridge. Even at a distance, the difference felt immediate. Sharp, restless, hungry. General Whitaker narrowed his eyes toward the darkness while cold wind swept across the porch, stirring the tails of old military coats and carrying frost through the lantern glow. How many? Silas asked quietly. Jeremiah Boone listened for several seconds before answering. 15, maybe 20. One of the cavalry riders farther down the valley shifted in the saddle and called softly through the snow. Town deputies? Whitaker shook his head once. Too fast. Evelyn stood in the doorway behind them, her shawl pulled tightly around thin shoulders while fear settled low in her chest for the first time that night. The first riders had arrived with silence. Discipline. Respect. These new ones sounded different. Like men chasing money instead of truth. Silas looked toward the leather satchel still resting beside the stove inside the cabin, then toward the approaching lights beyond the ridge. They know about the papers, he murmured. General Whitaker's jaw tightened beneath his gray beard. Word travels fast when powerful men start losing sleep. The riders across the valley began repositioning slowly now. Not aggressively. Carefully. Some guided horses closer to the fence line, while others turned toward the eastern ridge, watching the approaching group with quiet focus. No panic. No boasting. Just old soldiers settling into familiar instincts they probably hoped never to use again. Evelyn noticed something then that surprised her deeply. None of those men reached for rifles first. Instead, several dismounted and moved toward the cabin carrying supplies. One older rider unloaded blankets from his saddle. Another carried a crate of canned beans through the snow. A third quietly stacked fresh firewood beside her porch without being asked. Evelyn blinked in confusion. What are they doing? Jeremiah glanced toward her with a faint smile. Paying respect. For what? He looked toward Silas. For the man who kept most of us alive long enough to grow old. The words settled heavily in the frozen air. Evelyn studied Silas again beneath the lantern light. The wounded traveler she had dragged from the snow no longer seemed like a mystery drifting through winter. He looked like something else now. A man carrying years of loyalty he never asked for. The approaching riders grew closer. Lanterns bounced violently through the storm, while distant voices finally echoed faintly across the hills. Loud voices. Angry ones. General Whitaker exhaled slowly through his nose. There it is. Silas stepped carefully down from the porch despite the pain in his shoulder. I should leave before they reach the valley. Absolutely not, Whitaker answered instantly. You can barely stay upright. If they see this many men gathered here, somebody gets blamed. His eyes drifted briefly toward Evelyn. Likely her. The old widow stared at him in disbelief. You think I survived 12 Wyoming winters just to start fearing men with loud horses? For the first time that night, several nearby cavalrymen laughed softly beneath the blowing snow. Silas lowered his head slightly, almost embarrassed by her courage. Then the eastern riders finally emerged over the ridge. Dark coats, expensive saddles, rifles strapped openly beside bedrolls. At their center rode a heavy-set man wrapped in a black fur coat despite the storm. Even from 200 yards away, arrogance seemed to ride ahead of him like smoke. General Whitaker's face hardened immediately. Edgar Tolliver, he said quietly. Jeremiah muttered something beneath his breath that Evelyn did not catch. Silas simply closed his eyes once, tiredness suddenly returning to every line in his face. Evelyn looked between them. Who is he? Nobody answered right away. Then General Whitaker spoke softly enough that only those nearest the porch could hear. One of the men named inside those papers. And across the frozen valley, Edgar Tolliver's riders finally stopped their horses and stared directly toward Evelyn Harper's lonely cabin glowing beneath the Wyoming storm. Snow swept sideways across the valley as both groups of riders faced each other through the freezing dark. On one side stood the old cavalrymen beneath steady lantern light, their horses calm despite the storm. On the other sat Edgar Tolliver's men, shifting restlessly in expensive saddles, coats snapping hard in the wind. The distance between them could not have been more than 200 yards, but it felt wider than the plains themselves. Evelyn Harper remained on the porch, clutching her shawl tightly, while cold air burned in her lungs. Never in all her years had she seen so many men gathered before her cabin. And somehow the loneliest house in Wyoming had become the center of something much larger than fear. Edgar Tolliver finally guided his horse forward a few steps. The animal's black coat gleamed beneath snow and lantern glow, while the heavy-set man adjusted his fur collar with slow confidence. He did not look like a rancher or soldier. He looked like money wrapped in arrogance. Well now, Tolliver called across the valley, his voice smooth as polished whiskey. Seems Captain Reed found himself quite the welcoming committee. No one answered immediately. The cavalrymen remained silent in their saddles while snow collected along old hat brims and worn shoulders. General Whitaker eventually nudged his horse forward just enough for his voice to carry. You rode a long way in bad weather, Edgar. Tolliver smiled faintly. Truth usually travels in worse conditions. His eyes drifted toward Evelyn's cabin, toward the warm light glowing behind the frosted windows. I assume the papers are inside. Silas stepped forward on the porch before anyone else could answer. You already know they are. Tolliver looked directly at him then, and something sharp passed through the man's expression. Not hatred exactly. Irritation. The kind wealthy men felt toward people who refused to stay buried. 3 years, Captain, Tolliver said calmly. 3 years you vanished carrying documents nobody would have understood anyway. Silas leaned one hand against the porch rail briefly as pain crossed his face. Folks understand stolen land just fine. Several cavalrymen shifted quietly at that. Jeremiah Boone lowered his eyes while the wind carried snow between both groups like pale smoke. Tolliver sighed dramatically. You always did mistake stubbornness for morality. Then his attention moved toward Evelyn standing beside the cabin door. Ma'am, he called with sudden politeness. You seem like a respectable widow caught in unfortunate company. Evelyn stared back without flinching. Funny, she answered. I was just thinking the same about him. A few riders behind General Whitaker chuckled softly beneath the storm. Even Whitaker's beard twitched slightly. Tolliver's smile faded almost immediately. He was not used to poor widows answering him that way. I assure you, he continued smoothly. This matter does not concern your home. Evelyn looked toward the firewood stacked beside her porch. The blankets delivered by old cavalrymen. The men who rode through the night not for money, but loyalty. Then she looked back toward Tolliver's expensive coat and polished saddle. Seems to me, she said quietly, it already does. Silence settled heavily after that. Tolliver's men exchanged uncertain glances while the old cavalry riders remained perfectly still. Edgar Tolliver studied Evelyn carefully now, perhaps realizing for the first time that loneliness sometimes hardened people stronger than power ever could. Finally, he looked back toward Silas. You know this ends one way, Captain? Silas nodded once. With daylight. Tolliver frowned slightly. Meaning? Silas glanced toward the eastern horizon where the faintest gray line had begun touching the edge of the world beyond the hills. Dawn was coming. Slow but certain. Once the sun rises, Silas said quietly, every man out here will have to decide what side of this story he wants remembered. The wind swept across the valley again, and for the first time since arriving, several of Tolliver's riders lowered their eyes. The storm began easing just before dawn. Snow still drifted across the valley, but the hard Wyoming wind had softened into long, cold breaths moving through the fences and dead grass. Pale gray light slowly touched the eastern horizon behind Edgar Tolliver's riders, washing the frozen land in the color of old steel. Nobody moved. Both groups remained facing one another across the valley floor, while horses stamped quietly in the snow and lantern flames burned lower with each passing minute. Evelyn Harper stood near the porch rail, watching frost gather along the sleeves of her shawl. She had not slept. None of them had. Yet something strange settled over the valley now. Not fear exactly. Expectation. The kind that came before truths finally reached daylight. Silas Reed stepped carefully down from the porch into the snow despite Jeremiah Boone trying quietly to stop him. The old captain looked exhausted. Fever still hollowed his face, and each step seemed to cost him effort. But the moment he entered the open valley, every cavalryman straightened slightly in the saddle again. Even after years, they still followed his lead without being asked. Edgar Tolliver watched him approach with narrowed eyes. You look worse than your obituary, Tolliver remarked coldly. Silas ignored the insult entirely. Instead, he stopped halfway between both groups beneath the growing dawn and looked slowly across the riders gathered there. Some faces he recognized immediately. Others had aged beneath gray beards and weathered skin. Yet nearly all of them avoided meeting his eyes. 3 years, Silas said quietly, his voice carrying through the frozen air without shouting. 3 years I kept these records hidden because I believed the truth still mattered somewhere in this country. No one interrupted him. Snow drifted softly around his boots while the first pale sunlight touched the hills behind him. Silas looked toward Tolliver's men now. Most of you are ranch hands. Hired riders. Men trying to feed families through winter. His eyes moved from face to face carefully. You were told these papers contain lies. One younger rider, near Tolliver, shifted uncomfortably in the saddle. Another lowered his gaze entirely. Silas continued. Inside that satchel are the names of widows forced from homesteads. Soldiers denied land payments after the war. Settlers cheated by railroad contracts none of them could read. General Whitaker watched silently from horseback while the valley grew brighter around them. You know what the saddest part is? Silas asked softly. None of it surprised me anymore. Tolliver's jaw tightened beneath his fur collar. Careful, Captain. Silas turned toward him calmly. No, Edgar. That is what men like you spent years telling everybody else. A long silence followed. Then something unexpected happened. One of Tolliver's riders slowly removed his gloves and spoke quietly into the cold morning air. My father lost his ranch near Casper after the railroad came through. Every head turned toward him. The rider swallowed hard before continuing. Said some banker changed numbers on the contract after he signed it. Another rider farther back shifted uneasily. Same thing happened to my uncle. Tolliver wheeled sharply in the saddle. You boys do not know what you are talking about. But his voice lacked the smooth confidence it carried earlier. The dawn was stripping something away from him. The valley had become too quiet for lies to hide comfortably anymore. Evelyn watched from the porch as the riders slowly began looking at one another instead of at Silas. Men who arrived for money now forced to sit beneath daylight beside truths they already suspected deep down. Silas reached into his coat carefully and pulled out a folded paper from the satchel. He held it toward the growing sunrise. "This," he said quietly, "is the original land seizure order signed by Edgar Tolliver himself." Tolliver's horse shifted sharply beneath him, and for the first time all night, real uncertainty passed across the faces of the men riding beside him. The paper trembled slightly in Silas Reed's hand as the morning wind swept through the valley. Not because he was afraid, because exhaustion had finally settled deep into his bones after 3 years carrying secrets heavier than any saddlebag. Across from him, Edgar Tolliver sat frozen in the saddle while the dawn spread slowly over the Wyoming plains behind him. The polished confidence that wrapped around the wealthy landowner all night had begun cracking beneath daylight. Men could hide many things in darkness. Sunrise was less forgiving. One of Tolliver's riders cleared his throat uneasily. Another slowly loosened his grip on the reins. Nobody looked comfortable anymore. General Whitaker guided his horse forward a few feet through the snow, stopping beside Silas without speaking. The old cavalry officer simply sat there in silence beside the wounded captain like a man honoring something larger than loyalty. Evelyn Harper watched everything from the porch while steam rose from the fresh kettle she had placed beside the open doorway. Strange thing was, nobody seemed interested in fighting anymore. The valley felt too honest for it now, too exposed beneath the pale gold light creeping over the hills. Silas unfolded the paper fully and held it out toward the gathered riders. "Most of you cannot read the signatures from this distance," he said quietly. "But you know Edgar Tolliver's ranch seal." Several heads lowered immediately. They didn't know it. Everybody in 3 counties knew it. Tolliver's wealth touched railroads, banks, land offices, and nearly every sheriff election west of Cheyenne. For years, men like him operated like winter storms across the frontier. Too powerful to stop, too large to fight alone. Edgar Tolliver finally laughed once, but the sound landed hollow in the cold air. "You think one piece of paper changes anything?" Silas looked at him steadily. No, he glanced toward the cavalrymen gathered behind him, toward the hired riders now questioning their own employer, toward Evelyn standing beside a cabin barely holding itself together after years of lonely winters. "People do." The words settled quietly over the valley. No speeches followed. No dramatic shouting. Just silence. The kind that forces men to hear their own conscience clearly for the first time in years. Then something unexpected happened. A rider near the back of Tolliver's group slowly removed the rifle from his saddle and lowered it into the snow. Another rider beside him turned his horse away from the valley entirely. One by one, several men began backing away from Edgar Tolliver without speaking a single word. Tolliver stared around in disbelief. "Where exactly do you idiots think you are going?" Nobody answered him. One older ranch hand finally tipped his hat toward Silas instead. "My wife lost her family farm near Laramie," he muttered quietly. "I think I finally understand why." He turned his horse and rode east into the growing daylight. 2 more followed behind him. Then another. Edgar Tolliver's face darkened beneath the morning light as the valley slowly abandoned him piece by piece. No violence. No gunfire. Just men making choices. The cavalry riders remained still and silent throughout it all. They understood something younger men often forgot. The strongest victories rarely sounded loud. Evelyn stepped carefully down from the porch, carrying steaming cups of coffee on an old wooden tray. Even now, after everything, the old widow's first instinct remained kindness. She handed one cup toward General Whitaker, who accepted it with visible surprise. Another went to Jeremiah Boone. Then finally she stopped beside Silas. "You look about ready to collapse," she said softly. Silas accepted the cup carefully, his tired hands warming against the tin. For a moment neither spoke. Snow melted slowly from the porch roof, while sunlight touched the valley. For the first time that morning. Then General Whitaker removed his hat and looked toward Evelyn with quiet respect in his weathered eyes. "Ma'am," he said gently, "most folks would have shut their door last night." Evelyn stared out across the riders filling her lonely valley and answered with the simplest truth she knew. "Maybe," she whispered, "but hungry people deserve warmth before judgment." And all across the frozen Wyoming valley, old soldiers slowly bowed their heads toward the widow beside the cabin. By late morning, the storm had passed completely. The Wyoming sky stretched wide and pale blue above the valley, while melting snow dripped slowly from Evelyn Harper's porch roof in steady silver drops. Most of Edgar Tolliver's riders were gone now. Some had ridden east before sunrise. Others left quietly after hearing the names inside the papers Silas Reed carried for 3 long years. Only Tolliver himself remained near the far ridge with 2 silent men beside him, watching the valley like a gambler realizing the game had ended hours earlier. General Whitaker finally guided his horse forward through the thawing snow and stopped before Tolliver without anger or triumph. Just tired certainty. "It is over, Edgar," the old general said calmly. Tolliver looked toward Silas, standing near the porch with a steaming cup still warming his hands. Then toward the cavalrymen gathered around the widow's cabin. Men who had crossed frozen territory through the night for loyalty instead of profit. Something hollow settled into Tolliver's face after that. He gave a slow, bitter nod, turned his horse west, and rode away without another word. The 2 riders beside him followed. No cheers rose after they disappeared beyond the hills. No celebration. Only silence drifting softly across the valley while horses breathed clouds into the cold air. Old soldiers understood better than most that justice rarely sounded dramatic when it finally arrived. Silas leaned heavily against the porch rail once the last riders vanished from sight. The strain of the night had finally caught him. Evelyn noticed immediately. "Sit down before you fall down," she said softly. He obeyed without argument. This time, lowering himself carefully into Thomas Harper's old wooden chair beside the cabin wall. The same chair that had sat empty for 12 winters. Evelyn handed him another piece of fresh bread she had baked that morning using flour quietly left behind by one of the cavalry riders. Silas looked at the bread for a long moment before taking it. "You know," he said quietly, "I spent years meeting governors, bankers, generals." He glanced up at Evelyn. "Most of them offered less kindness than you gave a stranger with nothing." The old widow shrugged gently and stared out across the bright valley. Riders moved slowly through the snow now, repairing fence posts, stacking firewood, checking on Ranger beneath the lean-to like neighbors returning after a long absence. Her lonely property no longer felt forgotten. "Maybe folks stop seeing each other clearly once money gets involved," she murmured. General Whitaker overheard her while dismounting nearby. "That may be the wisest thing said in this valley all morning." Several riders laughed softly after that. The sound warmed the cold air better than sunlight. By afternoon, the cavalrymen prepared to leave. Horses were saddled, bedrolls tied down, lanterns packed away. Before mounting his horse, General Whitaker approached Evelyn slowly and removed a small leather pouch from inside his coat. Heavy, coin inside by the sound of it. Evelyn frowned immediately. "I did not help him for money." Whitaker nodded respectfully. "We know." He gently placed the pouch on the porch rail anyway. "That is not payment." Evelyn looked at him carefully. "Then what is it?" The old general smiled faintly beneath his weathered mustache. "Consider it 50 men finally paying their debt to decency." One by one, the riders mounted their horses beneath the afternoon sky. But before leaving, something remarkable happened. Without command or signal, every cavalryman stopped and turned back toward the widow's cabin. Then slowly, together, they removed their hats. Silence covered the valley once more. Not awkward silence. Reverent silence. The kind reserved for churches and graves and rare moments people carried their entire lives afterward. Evelyn stood frozen on the porch as row after row of old soldiers bowed their heads toward her small cabin at the edge of nowhere. Toward a poor widow who shared half a loaf of bread because somebody arrived hungry at her door. Silas looked toward her one final time before climbing carefully into the saddle beside General Whitaker. "Ma'am," he said softly, "out here men survive because of bullets." He paused while wind rolled gently across the open plains behind him. "But they keep living because of people like you." Then the riders turned west together beneath the endless Wyoming sky, leaving fresh tracks through melting snow while Evelyn Harper stood alone on her porch, no longer feeling forgotten by the world. And long after the last hoofbeat faded beyond the hills, the empty chair beside her cabin never looked empty again.